Welcome to this special presentation of West of Tulsa. We are broadcasting from Ventura, but we're about to take you to Santa Barbara in a moment. We got Dan here.
Yes,
Gabe's here.
Yep.
And we are going to actually take you back in time a little bit. We've been talking about our special project that we taped, beginning of June, I think it was, in front of a live audience.
June 8th.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and we taped this in front of a live audience. I know, it went by fast, didn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Really what we did was brought together 11 hot rod legends, what we've been kind of calling behind the scenes.
The Legends
Hot
of
Rod
Hot
Legend
Rod.
Show,
Yeah.
But the actual show for everybody who attended live was called Central Coast Racing, and it really was 11 guys, and we did have a couple women on there as well, but you'll see the presentation. But basically, the 11 guys on stage they go back to the 1940s and 50s and 60s of the early days of hot rodding and what would become NHRA and kind of what we know today. So you're going to hear stories during this presentation that are going to take you back in time. You're going to hear stories that I've never heard about, never read about. So
Stuff that's not on the internet, as Gabe says.
Not on the
internet.
Yeah.
True.
Well, even the guys that were in attendance who have a big history, who know a lot about racing, most of them said, I learned things that I didn't even know, even including things that I've argued with my friends about. We heard it from the guy that was actually in the event that was in question.
The quarter mile. Yeah, that's interesting stuff.
And he confirmed right then and there from the actual source itself. So it's like real-time fact-checking.
Yeah.
You know.
So I mean, we should explain to folks, too, why if we tape this live in front of an audience back in June, why we're just talking about it now. We did go back and forth on how we were going to present this to you. Yeah. And that was probably our biggest challenge.
It's a big chunk, 2 hours and 20 minutes. So it's feature length film length. It's like a long film too.
And it actually in the live audience went longer than that. So we ran out of space.
Well, and then a lot of things didn't go the way we had planned it. You know, this was the first event for us, working with Dana, he was great and helped us put this together. But we didn't really reherse it.
Right, it was just go for it.
Yeah,
right?
So it was kind of weird too, because it was kind of like this podcast vibe, but then it was this event, where we had a live audience.
Had almost 200 people there.
And there was a lot of things that didn't go. We had a lot of technical problems.
Cameras overheated and shut down.
Yeah,
that was fun.
A lot of first timers, that were helping us in the show. Alex Zaragoza and Caroline,
camera operator. She did great.
But we had a lot of things. We learned a lot from that day. It was our first event that we did. So
it was quite a event to put together and to execute in one night, and we ended up all getting home at 2 in the morning or something.
It was a lot, but
and then we had to turn around and go to Orange County the next morning at 5:30
Mercedes with Ho. It was so challenging. I mean, it was worth it because we got things on camera and audio, if you're listening to this, that will live forever. And these are stories that we want to get before, these guys are in their 70s, 80s, 90s, maybe even 90s, some in the 90s. Yeah,
right.
So we wanted to capture all this stuff. So we got that. So we felt, because we were planning to put this whole thing together as a part of a bigger, almost like a documentary type of thing. But we just, with the funding or the lack of funding and just the time, we just felt is probably better if we just put this thing out there as it's presented. Because so as a surprise to us, when we interviewed people after the event, they were blown away. I mean, it went as 2.5 hours. It was only supposed to be about an hour and a half, 2 hours max. It went 2.5 hours, and we had to cut it short because we had to get out of the venue. But people were saying, I could have listened to this for another hour. I was like, wow.
And when are you going to do it again?
Yeah.
And that's what I've had since, is when are you guys going to do another one?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not saying we wouldn't do another one. We just have to, based off the stuff that we learned, we would have to approach it.
It kicked our ass.
It definitely kicked our ass.
For 2 or 3 days, it kicked our ass.
Yes.
Right, Dan?
Definitely. Yeah. It was very tiring, and I'm glad we did it. It was a good learning experience, and these guys, I mean, that's the thing that's amazing about this, and for the audience, if you guys watch this, these guys may not be with us much longer. There's a lot of guys that are in their 80s, even in their 90s. Yeah. And they were there for history. This was literally history being made. So. And
I talk about this because I was up on stage hosting this, but one of the things I mentioned was that for years I'd go to car shows, again, mostly in this region, and people would say, you have to document these guys. Yeah. You have to get them on tape because as Seth Hammond, who was one of the panelists, mentioned, I spoke to him maybe a month before we taped this, and he said, if we would have done this 6 months ago, we would have had 2 more guys here.
Yeah.
So it was really important to do it when we did it, and we got them on tape, but now we want to share this with everybody.
Yeah. I mean, and even if you're not into racing or into old cars or any of this stuff, some of these stories that these guys tell, I mean, it's just, I think Chip Foose talked about his dad who liked to street race and who had a friend who was a cop who helped him get out of a lot of situations, and just some of those, just the stories alone, just ingenuity, trickery, and just kind of it was fascinating.
Behind the scenes of early days of racing.
Yes, and time period too is a lot of the guys were in the war, Korean War, World War II, and these guys come back from the war, they have nothing to do except for working on cars because they're mechanics or they're whatever. And I was just like, wow, this is so cool.
Yeah. And I think, I'm not going to give it away. You should watch the video. But when Chip talked about why he agreed to do this, I think you could hear everybody on the audience was just like, whoa. Mm-hmm. That was one of the best parts for me.
Yeah, because he was representing his dad.
His dad, Sam, right?
Yeah. So I thought that was really, really nice. And he gave homage to all these guys that helped him get started, which is really cool. So if you like Chip Foose, you'll want to watch this because a lot of his history is with these guys.
Yeah.
Working with them.
When he was a kid.
Exactly. Yeah.
Going over to their shops. You know, when his dad wouldn't let him have a tool or something, he'd go over to one of the shops next door. And it's fascinating to hear the early days, even years before Chip even came around.
Well, this is the genesis of California hot rod.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people don't realize that. They go, it started down in the valley somewhere, maybe Burbank or maybe downtown LA, and it's like, no, man, Central Coast was it.
Yeah.
That's where it
and
started.
Not just cars too, motorcycles too. The Langlo brothers, right? They're talking about how fast they ran and just the stuff that they did on a motorcycle.
And how fast they're still running.
And these guys are still racing.
Yeah. What would he do? Over 300?
Yeah.
And he's in his 70s?
I think 80s.
Is he?
I think he's in the 80s, yeah.
Man. So, I mean, and you could hear gasps in the audience when they found out that just 2 weeks ago or whatever it was, he was out of Bonneville.
Yeah.
And we had people from all walks of life, ages, young people, old people, whatever. They were all... it's funny because Dan and I were sitting in the back in our control booth kind of watching the show, and I'm looking at the audience, because we're behind everybody, and I think only 2 people got up in the 2.5 hours to go to the bathroom or just leave.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow.
And one of them was, because I was told this after the show, one of the guys who got up and left was driving the early Indy 500 car that was on display before the event started, and he had to get home because there are no headlights on it.
Oh, geez. Wow.
And speaking of that, that was really cool. Dan and I didn't get to see very much of this because we were inside the auditorium the whole time. Was all the cars and motorcycles that were there up front, and it was just cool and everybody's talking outside. Yeah. I know Beth got to talk to a lot of people,
and you'll see some of that. So we're going to put together some of the video at some point and share it with you. That video as well. So it was really fun to. I mean, I had kept going inside and outside because I was trying to organize on the inside, but I wanted to see what was going on outside with the motorcycles and the old cars.
Yeah, and just the venue alone, the Santa Barbara Natural History Museum was amazing. It was such
great
a
theater.
Cool spot.
Yeah, great theater.
It's just nice and quiet. It was like the perfect place because it's an old building. It's fit the whole thing. You couldn't have asked for anything
history,
better.
Talking about history.
Exactly.
It was a perfect setup.
And shout out to Arley at the Santa Barbara Natural History Museum. I don't think she's there anymore, but
she was a huge help.
Oh, she was
super cool.
Everybody was super helpful. It was great. I don't think we could have pulled it off the way we did without the help from people like Arley and the Natural History Museum and your family, Katie and Beth and Helm and Alex and Caroline and Dan. And then Dan brought in his partner Greg, his business partner, that helped us with the audio, which was amazing. He did a great job on that.
Yeah, had a great PA system, no feedback. Everyone could hear what everyone was saying.
It was great because everybody thought we were way more professional than we actually are. So, I thought I'll take that as a pat on the back.
Exactly. We learned a lot. There's no doubt about it.
Oh, yeah.
We said it kicked our ass, but we probably would do it again.
Which is funny because we all work in the TV film industry professionally and have been on set, have been on location, in studio. But this is different because we did everything all on our own. This is, we all wore multiple hats and, got a lot of stuff done, but because we had to, because we didn't have a big budget or any budget for this. So, I was pretty happy that we did it. So I hope whoever enjoys it. So
yeah, I had fun.
I don't know if I'll say I had fun, but it was an interesting experience.
Dan's so funny. Watching him pack up.
We shot it with 8 cameras. So 8 cameras, and we had 11 people on
stage.
mic.
Yeah. And the challenge of recording clean audio for the recording itself and then having it for a live audience is a huge challenge.
Yeah, shout out to Greg.
That's why we brought in Greg, right?
Yeah,
we needed a pro to do that.
So real funny story about that. So after the event, Steve Feist, who we've had on the show a few times, he's funny. He said, throughout the show, he could hear somebody's voice. And he was getting pissed off throughout the event. And he was about to turn around.
You don't want to piss off Steve.
Oh, hell no, you don't want to piss him off. Yeah. He was about to get up and turn around and tell whoever to shut the up, right? And he actually turned around at one point because he knew the camera was right behind him. He did turn around at one point and he realized it was Dan. He was like, "Okay, cool. I don't have to. Okay, so Dan, I don't have to kick his ass."
Yeah, I'm like directing the show, so I can't whisper.
Yeah, I mean, it was so quiet in there, and it was very intimate. We were all packed
you could
together.
hear a pin drop with 200 people.
Yeah,
in the room,
so you could hear Dan, giving his call outs to Alex or Caroline or whoever, doing
or Gabe saying, "A camera overheated. It went down. Crap."
Yeah. So,
well, I mean, should we just go to it? I mean, since we have 2.5 hours to show everybody,
let's go to it. Now we're going to break this up into 2 pieces, right?
2 pieces, right?
Okay, so this is part 1 of this event you guys are going to see, and it cuts off at a certain point, and then we're going to do a part 2. We'll do another little intro for that to contextualize it.
People should know we did not edit anything out.
Yeah.
This is all it's
a raw recording of the evening.
Yeah. So if you're watching it, you might see some cameras fidgeting around or audio's pretty much, but there's we don't have any like edited intro or edited takes. This is all literally how we shot.
And we just let people talk. We just let them talk. We didn't cut anybody off. We just said, you just go tell your story.
It's funny because we had CJ, you were as the moderator, the host of the show, but we really didn't hear from you very much.
Yeah. Well, I just tried to keep it going a little bit, but mostly it was just, let them talk. Let them tell their story. That was the whole point of the evening, was to document all of this.
For sure.
Yeah.
And we really, I know we had some time factors in terms of, a recording and how much we had in terms of hard drive to record this stuff.
Yeah.
But for the live audience, I think they loved it.
Yeah. And also, speaking of audience, we had Seth Hammond's wife, Tanis, come up on stage and share a little bit about her experience in Bonneville. So in the second part,
you want to see that one?
Yeah, we talked about Bonneville and their particular family. The whole family went over 300 miles an hour. But Tanis was talking about that whole thing and how she's faster than her husband and the jabbing that she did with him. So that'll be in part 2, which I definitely recommend you stick around to watch that because it was a really cool story to hear from Tanis.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
So it was 11 dudes and 1 lady.
Yeah.
Yep.
And she's the fastest of all of them.
Exactly, which is hilarious.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, it was.
A little highlight that I happen to recall right now.
Right. Well, I will say this. I think we ought to just toss it to the video.
Let's go to the tape.
Sit back. We hope you enjoy it. Enjoy this special presentation of the West of Tulsa.
Good evening, everyone. What you're about to witness is racing royalty here. It is very hard to get these many super guys in one place, but you're going to witness something very historic and fun. So a couple things. First of all, make sure your cell phones are off. You have bathrooms right outside the door and straight ahead. And also we have waters for everybody if you want one. Anyway, I'd like to first, and we have books also for sale, and Tony Baker is the de facto historian for all racing, especially on the West Coast. Why don't we give Tony a little hand here? And he'll be here to sign books, and also Ed Langlo has his books on motorcycle racing over there. Thank you, Ed.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank our sponsors. First, it's the AACA Santa Barbara Club. We have Milpas Motors with Jim Crook, thank you. We have Pure Tech Water with Jim Harris, thank you. And the Natural History Museum. So at this time, I'd like to bring up the CEO of the Santa Barbara Natural History Museum, Luke Swetland.
Watch behind you.
How about a round? And Luke's profession is actually collecting money. So I'm going to give him a check for tonight. And any words for us, Luke?
Well, folks, I want to welcome you to Santa Barbara's oldest museum. We've been in service to this community in the Central Coast for 108 years. I'm delighted to call Dana Newquist a friend personally and one of the museum's most stalwart and generous supporters for more years than I've been here. So Dana, thanks for putting together this little rally for us tonight. Thank you so much.
It's a privilege, Luke. Thank you. Okay, we are very fortunate to have our very own CJ Ward as our moderator tonight. So CJ, come on up. Thank you for all you do, CJ.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm taking over? Is that?
You're taking
all
over.
All right. Thank you, Dana. I apologize for the TV part of this. You're waiting until we got the camera set up, but we want everybody to look good tonight since we got them all here. Thank you all for coming and sitting patiently while we go through all this. We really appreciate it. This is a big deal. I mean, we go to car shows all the time, and one of the things I'm told is you guys have to do something to document these stories. I mean, they're here, they're great stories, and they are great stories. I can't wait to hear you guys tell them from memory. And I mean, I've seen black and white photos, but I want to hear the stories, and I know that's why everybody is here today. So we do have a TV part of this. It's for you, the live audience, but we're also recording this as well. And we're recording it because we want this to last forever. We're going to document this and preserve it. And these stories up here are about a priceless time. And I can't wait to hear the stories. So what we're going to do is we're going to record it, and then we're going to jazz it up in post-editing so you can watch it again, and the folks that aren't here can watch it. By the way, this is actually pretty good considering we didn't promote this thing at all. We were getting nervous out there, like, who's showing up today? So thank you very much for coming out here. So it's West of Tulsa is the name of our program, if you will. It's a YouTube channel. We started it about 5 months ago, and the whole point of it is to preserve stories like theirs. And so, again, we're going to have that on our social medias and on our podcast and all the platforms and YouTube. So, okay, enough talking because I know you guys have been sitting here waiting. So I'm going to bring up Tony Baker. He's a historian. He's written 7 books on a lot of the stories that they're going to tell tonight. So, Tony, thank you for coming up and giving us setting a little background here for us. That microphone should be on, but he's going to set it up. He's going to give us a sense of just why this area, the Santa Barbara, Goleta, Central Coast, really was so important to racing history. Tony, take it away.
And that's true. The Central Coast of California has had probably an outsized influence on hot rod culture and the culture of motorsports in general. Most of the towns along U.S. Highway 101 that kind of links all the whole Central Coast, it's like the backbone. Most of the towns from Ventura County to San Luis Obispo have made, as I said, great contributions to this culture. And during the post-war period of the late 40s and early 50s, popular enthusiasm for all types of motorsports really virtually exploded out here on the coast. And all these towns along the 101, pretty much each one had a dirt track for racing. At the same time was the growth of car club culture. And Santa Barbara had its own ones, the Dusters, the Igniters. And most of these clubs were made up predominantly of teenage boys and young men in their 20s that had maybe learned mechanics during their service time. They went from illicit street races to more organized events held in the deserts like El Mirage. And eventually a group of the fastest guys formed a little club called the Santa Barbara Acceleration Association and took over an abandoned Marine Air Station in Goleta, which turned into the first legally sanctioned drag strip in the country. Now, in spite of what people in the southern counties might claim, Goleta was the first, and other operations quickly sprang up throughout Southern California, but the one that started at Goleta was the prototype for drag strips that came up all over the country. A few years later, in 1956, a club from Ventura, the Motor Monarchs, went to Kansas City to compete in the first NHRA Nationals. They took home the trophies for fastest at B-Class Roadster and Modified, so there's a big contribution right there. Now, while drag racing had its start in the region, for many years the predominant and probably the earliest form of motorsports has been dirt track racing. Again, the gem of the dirt tracks along the 101 was the Thunderbowl and Carpinteria. From 1947 to the early 60s, the track, situated on a bluff above the Pacific Ocean, echoed with the roar of engines as brightly painted jalopies competed for first place, thrilling huge crowds of spectators. Today, while it's greatly diminished, dirt track racing still exists on the coast, and the tracks in Ventura and Santa Maria are still hanging on there. Santa Barbara and Goleta, already the birthplace of drag racing, also became host of twice-yearly road races, beginning in 1952, and went on for 2 decades, drawing as many as 30,000 people to the famous Santa Barbara road races at the airport. Goleta also possesses a large group of members of the 200-mile-an-hour club, who represent the region on the hallowed grounds of Bonneville Salt Flats. That's true. Every year during Speed Week, teams from the Central Coast can be found with their cars carrying on a long tradition of competitive racing by those of us fortunate to live here on the Central Coast. So please, I'm going to get off now, so please join me in welcoming our illustrious panelists here who are actually there doing the things that I've just described to you. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much. So this is kind of informal. I'm going to give this to Dana because here's the thing. Dana may be sitting down, but I know he's thinking of questions. and he can't help himself. So I'm giving him the extra microphone. All right, I'm going to introduce everybody up here on the stage right now. If I can get the microphone out. There we go. I'm going to start with Dan Hogan, who's sitting right next to me to my right. And I'm going to work my way around this way. Dan Hogan, growing up in a small town in Illinois, Dan in his teenage years began racing. During Dan's stint in the service, he traveled and photographed several famous cars and drivers throughout Europe. Eventually, Dan settled in Santa Barbara, where Dan raced at the Santa Barbara Airport races. And we're going to hear more about that coming up in a minute. Dan, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
There's so much more I could say about every one of these people, but we don't want to be here all night long, so I'm going to keep it to short paragraphs. Mike Cleary, a Midwest boy, Mike became obsessed with cars and eventually racing a variety of vehicles from small-bore Crosley to his famous 1932 Studebaker race car. You saw it out front, that beautiful blue car. Gorgeous. Mike Cleary, thank you for being here, and thank you for bringing the Studebaker.
Thank you for inviting. It's a pleasure to be here.
Next, we have Bob Patterson. Bob grew up in the Oakland area and was an All-American athlete. Racing was a huge influence where he eventually secured not one, but 2 Corvette Grand Sports. And Bob raced all over the southern U.S. Bob, welcome.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Next, Orwin Middleton. Growing up in the San Fernando Valley, Orwin eventually became involved with Steve Earle, creating the Laguna Seca vintage races. Many of us have been to that. In the late 1980s, Orwin was racing the famous Washburn Chevrolet 59 Corvette. Orwin, thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Next, we have Seth Hammond. Speed was always Seth's mantra, if you will. What did I say? Speed?
Like in a car, though, not like the other.
I just wiped out. Yeah. Speed was always Seth's mantra. Having been a machinist, that fit right into his quest and determination to build a Lakester for racing Bonneville and achieving 323 miles an hour. As we know, Seth, a local guy, has been very active in other racing, including vintage. So, Seth, welcome.
Thank you.
Next, Lee Hammock. Lee raced at several tracks with various types of vehicles beginning in the 1940s. One of the most famous tracks throughout the 40s and 50s was the Thunderbowl in the Carpinteria area. Now long gone, it can be revived by Lee tonight.
Thank you.
In those races. Lee, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Next, Chip Foose. Having been raised in Goleta, Chip's father, Sam, began customizing in high school, and due to Sam's amazing work, Project Design was born. Sam's influence and reputation on body and paint became the standard by which all others followed. Enter Chip. Growing up with the influential father, Chip turned his passion to automotive design. An early job at the shop of Sternberger Kleene led to Chip's admission to Design Center Pasadena, and the combination of Chip's father, Sternberger Kleene, and the Design Center gave Chip the tools to launch his famous career. By the way, there was a little show called Overhauling thrown in there at one point. Welcome, Chip. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And next, Jim Harris, growing up in Ventura with a father owning Harris Motor Company, a DeSoto and Plymouth dealership. By 14, he became a line mechanic at the dealership, and Jim built several competitive drag racers with the Motor Monarchs, which we just heard about. In 1956, the Monarchs went to Kansas City to compete in the NHRA Nationals, and Jim became very talented, adapting and tuning Hemi motors, making the flatheads of the era underdogs. Jim, thank you for coming in today.
Thank you.
Next, Roy Miller. Without question, Santa Barbara put its stamp on racing with the advent of Santa Barbara Airport races, and most notable races of the day attended and raced at the Santa Barbara Airport, including James Dean. The list is really long. We just threw James Dean in there because everybody will know that one. Yes, Roy was there. Roy was Steve Ford, created the most popular radio show, Guy Talk.
Correct.
Roy, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Arley Langlo, raised by his father Clarence. Sundown Langlo, a charter member of the Santa Barbara Motorcycle Club, influenced his boys to the racing world. Arley recently, at 84 years old, ran 301 last month at El Mirage.
Oh, wow. Hey.
Man. Yeah. And that's just 2 miles an hour short of the record.
Wow.
Arley, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Glad to see you after 301 miles an hour. Next time. Yeah, next time. That's right. Next, we have Ed Langlo, also the son of Clarence. Ed joined his brother Arley at Bonneville and became a historian of motorcycle racing with his dad's large archive. And with the help of Tony Baker, Ed published the book, Santa Barbara Motorcycle Racing, and that is available tonight. I think it's over there on the table. Is that?
Yes, it is.
All right. Ed, thank you.
Thanks, CJ.
All right, so now we know everybody up on the stage. All right, I'm going to start off with, I don't know, the easiest question, right? You just start off with an easy question. Who's the best driver up here?
Arley's
the fastest.
Arley's the fastest.
Arley's the fastest.
Oh, that's why I didn't ask that question, because I knew who the fastest was, but I was going to say who's the best driver. But you guys think about it for a little bit, and let's. I'm going to start with.
Yeah, that's hilarious. Yeah.
Yeah, somebody thinking who's the fastest? Did I hear anything? Let's start with Roy. Roy, and I'm going to go around to each person. How did you end up into racing?
It was a passion of mine as a kid. Just something about the idea of growing up and racing cars. Cars are my genuine interest from day one. So one thing kind of led itself to another. And I, in those days, the mid-'60s, I was working for a place that was doing some preparation for SECA racing. And so I got a little bit more motivated and involved in it, and eventually wound up buying my own car and racing it all over the country.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I'll go to the Langlo brothers next. Who wants to start? How did you guys get into racing? What sparked it for you guys?
Born into it.
Okay.
My dad was a racer, so
it was natural.
I was in the middle of it ever since I can remember.
Yeah.
Born or forced into it?
What?
Born into it or forced into it by Dad?
Born into it.
Yeah. And Ed, what about you? Is it the same thing, just your father's influence?
Well, yeah, most of what I'm going to talk about tonight is the history of motorcycle racing in Santa Barbara, and that's based on my father and the Santa Barbara Motorcycle Club. I ran a car at Bonneville, B-Fuel Coupe and Sedan class for about 5 years, but that was just based on wanting to drive something over 200 miles an hour, and we went out there and did that. Probably the best ride I ever had out there was getting my driver's license. You have to go through a series of tests to get your driver's license. So in your B-class license, you can go over 275, but you can't go over 200. On your A-class license, you go over 200, and you go as fast as you want. The car was brand new. It had never been run. We didn't know what it was going to do. I was a new driver, so I just let it all hang out. The national record was 221 miles an hour, and on my licensing pass, I went 235.
Oh.
So that was the most memorable time I think I ever had.
Well, that would get you into it for sure. Jim Harris, how did you get in? Where did the love for racing come for you?
Well, my father had a dealership, so I was raised in it. And I have a picture, 5 years old, pair of coveralls covered with grease and oil. So it was organic.
Still in your blood, right? Yeah. All right. Chip, what about your dad, Sam? Where did the love of racing come for him?
Well, my dad grew up here in Santa Barbara, of course. He was born in Long Beach, moved up here as a kid, and then he got into racing, and he was in the Igniters, which was started in the early 50s from Santa Barbara High School. And when he went into Korea, or he went into the military, he was in Korea, but his passion was cool cars and racing. And I've heard a lot of stories about things that he's done, but he was also, I would say he was more interested in making cars beautiful. So we painted a lot of hot rod or race cars, but we really didn't get into, he raced on the street, wasn't exactly legal. Yeah. And then one of his best friends, Gary Henshaw, they both loved to race. Well, Gary, he joined the police force, so then he could run around with a police car and have my dad chase him, or he could chase my dad. And that's how they would go to parties. So, I mean, it was more convenient to have a police officer that he could race with.
Love it.
I remember when I was 14 years old, I inherited my grandfather's toolbox. And when I was going through it, I found 2 newspaper articles. And the first one was sports car driver nabbed after 45-minute chase. And I read the article, and it's about my father, and he was in his 53 Corvette. And they chased him for 45 minutes, and they found him in a driveway with the lights out. And when the officer walked up to him, he hit him over the head with a bully club, and he woke up in jail. And,
so it wasn't his buddy who caught him then. It was somebody else.
He loved to race, but not legally. Yeah. And then the second article was sports car driver to serve 10 days in county jail. So I put a photo album together for my father and gave it to him for his birthday. So when he opened it up, the first 2 pages were these 2 articles. And I was, like I said, I was 14. So when I gave that to him, I said, okay, when I get my license, you can't say anything.
Great story.
Yeah.
Lee, how did you get the fire to race? Where did that come from?
Well, my father was very much involved in racing back in the 30s. And I found a picture of myself. I was a year and a half old in one of those old sprint cars at some dirt track that he and his partner owned and ran. And
I guess I automatically inherited that gene, and then of course we lived back in St. Louis at the time, and then when we moved out here during the Great War, the best times of my life, I think, were A, when the war ended, and B, when I discovered hot rods, high school, and girls. And then I was fortunate enough to be good friends with all the older guys that came home from the war. And they were all into their hot rods again and so forth, bringing the cars back out. And we started going out to El Mirage, the dry lakes. And I was fascinated by the cars and the engineering and so forth. So I was fortunate that the older guys took this young kid with them. I was only in high school at the time. But my mother had given me an old box camera that she had, and I started taking pictures. And a lot of the pictures that I still have are in the archives now of this. When I was introduced into this, it's called the American Hot Rod Foundation. And it was quite an honor for me to be involved in that. Well, then like I say, during the late 40s and early 50s, I was fortunate enough to be able to start racing at Carpinteria. And then also at that same era is when I was involved with the Goleta Drag Racing Association.
And we have a story about where you learned to stick shift.
Pardon?
We learned where you learned to change the gears. So Dana's what we call Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, the 1926 Locomobile.
Yes.
You know that car well, don't you?
Yes, I do.
You want to tell everybody why you know that car so well?
When I went to Santa Barbara Junior High School, that car was in our auto shop. And it was jacked up, drive shaft off. It still had, the motor ran there, no body on it. And we sat on an apple crate, or well, actually at the end it was an orange crate or lemon crate. But, and that's how Mr. Sexton, who was our teacher, was teaching young kids how to drive a car, how to shift, and he had to go through the whole thing. Well, I was in Montecito School in the 8th grade, and then they took us over to introduce us to Santa Barbara Junior High. So we went around, and older friends that I had took us all around, and anyhow, I went into the classroom, and there was this car sitting there, plus these old Model Ts that we had to work on eventually. So Mr. Sexton says something about, do you know how to drive? I said, well, a little bit, yeah. So he said, okay, well, show me what you could do. So I got up there, and I put neutral, started the car, went through the gears, I did everything just perfect. And shut it off, and I thought, boy, I did good. And he scolded me because I didn't put the handbrake on when I finished. Yeah.
I love
but then,
and that's the same car that's sitting out there today.
Yeah.
Wow.
Later on, when I actually took his class, we were running the car and teaching kids he was teaching kids how to drive and everything. And he told me, he said, well, why don't you just take over and you teach these kids how to drive the car? So that was the beginning of that little episode.
You took over classes.
Yeah.
That's fun.
And then I was very excited because I heard they were building a racetrack in Carpinteria. And the closest races that I was able to ever attend at that point in time after the war was Santa Maria, the old half-mile fairground track. They had some midget races. Now, midgets are small cars, not little people, Anyway, I borrowed the family car, and off we went to the races. Well, then I was pretty excited about the fact that I wasn't going to have to go so far. Well, some of the older guys used to go to the races in Los Angeles, Gilmore Stadium, the Coliseum, and a couple of other places, of course, Saugus. And then we'd go to the dry lakes afterwards. And they allowed me to join them and go along with them. So that was quite an episode for me. But then like I say, I started driving. I went to work for Frank Colson in Carpinteria. He had a little garage there, and they built a jalopy. Well, I wasn't 21 years old. You were supposed to be 21 years old to drive legally. I was only 19, I think, at the time. And so they used to sneak me into I didn't have to sneak into the track, but he used to pay my pit passes, and I'd get into the track, and nobody ever questioned my age or anything. I guess I was a big enough kid that it didn't bother me. And I worked on the car. Well, he had another driver driving it. And they used to let me go out in a wheel pack, that they called it. When the track was first wet down, they had everybody go out and wheel pack the track down. Well, that was a big thrill for me, of course. And
this is at the
At the Thunderbowl, that's correct. And then one night, the driver was late getting there, so the car had to qualify for either the main event or the semi-main event. Well, Frank told me, well, go ahead and qualify the car. So I did, and I qualified it. I did pull in. He was all excited. He said, well, you just qualified for the main event. He said, this car's never been in the main event. So I was pretty stoked about that.
Is that the beginning of your race career right there?
That started my career at Thunderbowl.
Oh, yeah.
And then about the same time, of course, there was a small group of the older fellows that started the Galita Association. And of course, they took me in under the wing because they were the same guys that I went every place with. And so I believe I'm the only remaining charter member of the SBAA, Santa Barbara Acceleration Association.
Yeah.
And I think I'm the only member locally that ran at Carpinteria Thunderbowl.
Wow.
But I hate to tell you my age.
Wow. Well, thank you. I mean, we're going to talk about the Thunderbowl a little bit here in a second. We're going to get everybody else's memories of the Thunderbowl as well. But Seth, tell us, what got you into racing? What started it for you?
I was thinking about that. I think what started for me was we used to read Popular Mechanics magazine, and there was always talking about things that you could build at home, and I was always pretty industrious trying to build coasters and trying to build all sorts of things. I was about 8 years old or so. But there was a couple of guys in town that were building go-karts. So one was Warren Wheatley and one was, I can't remember, Gordon Azevedo. Warren's dead, but Gordon's still alive. But at any rate, we used to race go-karts on the tarmac at the Santa Barbara Airport where the current terminal building is. And so that's really the first place I ever entered a race. And then Cementa Nautica actually sanctioned go-kart racing. And I actually won a trophy, if you can believe that. And somewhere I've got this silver bowl that says second place. I mean, it wasn't first, and nobody remembers who second is, but hey, you got to start somewhere. Yeah. But that's pretty much what got me interested in racing. And then when my driver's license arrived, then it was, let's go to Bob Jenks, because my dad was a client of Bob Jenks, and let's see the race cars. And it was a disease forever.
Yeah. You come a long way since go-karts.
Yeah.
Orwin, Middleton, how did it start for you?
Well, I guess I did a lot of illegal street racing from the San Fernando Valley. I did a lot of autocrossing. I ran at the San Fernando drag strip. I guess when I really started getting interested in racing, was more as a spectator than anything else. And then, fortunately, I became good friends with Steve Earle, who started the Monterey Historic Races, and a friend of mine had come up here from Los Angeles, and I accompanied him because he wanted to buy an old Corvette. And so he would always take me along because I knew something about them. And we went to an auto parts store on Upper State Street, and there was a car that was advertised as the original Washburn Chevrolet 59 Corvette as driven by Bob Bondurant in B production. And I thought, well, that's a pretty heavy-duty piece. I don't know if it's the car or not, but I looked it over and I could tell that it had originally been a race car. And if my friend didn't buy it, I told him I was going to buy it. Well, that piqued his interest, so naturally he bought it. And he owned the car for, 4 or 5 years, and then he was going to sell it. In the meantime, I moved up here, and I would talk with Steve a lot about racing early Corvettes, and this friend of mine was going to sell the car, and he was going to drive it to the Monterey races, put a sign in it telling exactly what it was, and somebody certainly would have bought it. And I was in there telling Steve about it one day, and he says, we cannot let that car get out of the area because some guy from the east is going to buy it and is just going to sit around in his garage, and they're going to smoke cigars and tell lies about it. And he says, we need to get that car, and you need to drive it. I said, fine, I can do that. So that's what we did. And I restored it and started running in official races at the Monterey Historics, and which are sports car road races, and started doing pretty well with it. And it just kind of blossomed from there. So that's.
So it was a race car.
Yeah, it was.
It was a race car.
Yeah, well, it was a race car, and it was a real race car. You'd tow it to the track on a trailer. You didn't drive it on the street. It had a locked rear end and loud exhausts and a tilt and clutch, and it was pretty fast. It was very competitive in its class. And I was fortunate that I won a few races with it, and so then Steve took it, and he was driving it, and I built another one out of a '57 Corvette, and which was kind of the same thing with that too. So that was when I became an official race car driver.
All right, Bob, how did it start for you?
Oh boy, we were all growing up probably as car guys, and if you weren't, you kind of stumbled into it, and at some point in time you had to fix things, otherwise you walked. So that was kind of the deal. And then into the 60s, like Orwin was talking about autocrossing, that kind of took off, and we were in a club, and every weekend we'd be going out there, and we had some people in the club that really shared their thoughts and ideas, engineers and a physics guy that ended up running the Livermore Rad Lab in the 80s. It tells you something about what we saw. And long and short is they basically taught us in this autocrossing world and being in a club and having our cars what and how to do and how to think about going around corners in autocrossing. That's the little small corners, and then you're jumping to the next one, and you try to straighten out some of these corners to make a straight line. Shortest distance between 2 points, a straight line, which is time, which is winning or losing. And so we kind of got into doing all of those kinds of things, and that kind of really taught us how to really work cars. And then as I was going down Lives Work and doing it out there, one day a guy shows up at an autocross with a Grand Sport. And you say to yourself, a Grand Sport? And most of us say, God, I've never seen one of those. What exactly is that? And you say, gee, I think it's a lightweight and that kind of thing. And so through a little time, kind of discovered, oh my goodness, he found it, and it had gone through Macomb and then to a fellow Svejian in Texas, and then to a Air Force guy, and Arizona ended up, and this fella that was in the Bay Area there, he discovered it and went down and bought it and brought it back and had it for 4 or 5 years. And then somewhere in the early 70s, or 72, 73, he's an HP, Hewlett-Packard kind of guy, and kind of a really, really bright, geeky kind of guy. And they were going to take off with their information, things that they were doing, new products and so forth. So he wanted to sell it, and oops, yeah, here's an opportunity. And so I was able to take that earlier stuff that I learned about how to put together suspension and handling, braking, turning, all of that in short corners and so forth. And then with the Grand Sports, you're thinking, wait a minute, that's got history to it. And back to NASA and all the things. And that kind of made me then think, wouldn't that be interesting to kind of run on a road course? And gee, all that means is you've got long straightaways in between all these corners that you run. And so I just thought, that's interesting. And this gets into the 75, 76 time frame. And I happened to be, it was around 4th of July. And I looking in the green section of the San Francisco Chronicle there. And you start to read the thing, and it's got all this different information on it. And then one of the things on there said, oh, boy, we're looking for people who want to go racing, and Monterey Historic, and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, ooh. And so this is about the 5th of July. So I call up the guy, and the number that's on there, and he said, oh, yeah, we've got that there. But we closed it on July 1. He said, but what do you have? And I said, well, you're probably not too familiar with it. It's called a Corvette Grand Sport, and it's a lightweight, and they made 5 of them. And he said, oh, I know what that car is. And yeah, by the way, we have a place for that. I went, oops. And through that process, that really kind of got me into the vintage race world. And then you start going back in time. Nothing older than last year's race cars in our lives. Well, now you've got something that you carry forward with. And so through the next few years, that's what I did. And I just saw it as an opportunity to really kind of express, what should have been done with the cars, because they didn't get to run that much. And so it was really a fun process. And I picked a moment in time. It was the Sebring 64 event there. A.J. Foyt was driving. And I thought, you know what, that make-em owned it, had a good look to it, all those things. So I got it back to that, restored it to that, and then we drove it up into the end of the 80s before I ultimately said, and I look at it a little bit like art and other kinds of things in life. We go down the road, we enjoy, and then we share, and then at some point in time, we pass it on. And obviously money's in there and some things, but aside from that, we don't take anything with us. And so I just thought, it's a moment in time. Gee, I did everything I could do. Somebody else could probably express. So then I carried that in, sold it and carried it over, found a historic 57 Corvette, still have it. So here we go.
All right. Yeah. Mike, what about you? How did it start for you?
Well, it's interesting. I kind of relate to some of the guys here who had a automotive background, or their fathers were in an automotive background. My father joined the Studebaker Corporation in 1925, and he worked, in effect, for them, either directly or as a subcontractor for the rest of his life. And that should have brought me to racing, I guess, except he treated cars like appliances. That was a washing machine or whatever. And so I didn't get it there. And but inversely, because when I got to high school, grade school it was okay. High school, I fell in homeroom, a lot of evil companions. They believed Fords were the best thing in the world. And I'd grown up that Studebakers were the best thing in the world, and that automatically made a competitive situation. And so Studi had a 52, they had a V8, and Ford was still overhead, and they were still playing with flatheads. So the street racing got pretty good. And I was going to the midget races, and we were doing a little sweet racing. This is in Chicago area. And there was a wonderful on-ramp onto the Edens Freeway Expressway that was about a half-mile long with no intersections, and and nobody ever went on it, and it was wide enough you could really do a good job with a drag race. And then another evil companion came to our high school, and he was from California, and he brought along an MGTD. And that was a major influence. Somehow that really set to me that they were kind of a very interesting car. And sure as hell handled better than my Studebaker. So he took us to the sports car races at one of the SAC races where the General LeMay had his Air Force boys putting on sports car races at the airfields. And we went down to Rantoul, Illinois, and his MG, and we had a hell of a time. And there was a 4.5 Ferrari with Jim Kimberly and Freddie Wacker in a Cat Allard and Sherwood Johnson in a C-Jag, pardon me, and a whole bunch of others, Hal Ulrich and the Excalibur, and you name it. It was all there. And I was absolutely in love. It was the way to go. A quarter mile just didn't hang in there with being able to drive for many, many miles and around corners and down straightaways. It was fabulous. And so my buddy and I went home and tried to decide what car to buy or what car to build, and couldn't afford to buy one. And a Crosley engine came to my way, and a frame from when somebody had built a coupe dragster out of a Topolino and left the frame and suspension and rear end and tranny sitting there. That was perfect. And there was a tube manufacturer just around the corner that had a scrap pile of good tubing. And a buddy of mine, George Howell, son of a dentist, how about that for a name, lent me his torches, and we were off to the races, except I was too young. And we had we welded up a car, and then Bill Devon came along and rescued us from having to bend up Cinzano signs. And I turned 21 on September 1st, 1957, and I was at the racetrack on the 7th. 7 days later, and up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I learned a very important race car lesson that weekend. My good buddy, Verge Exner Jr., who was in school with me, and he was building a Simca Special, and another fellow, Del Coates, and followed us up there. We drove our cars to the race. Bad idea. I took third in the race, but I blew the clutch, and the car had to stay in Grand Rapids for a month or two until I could find a trailer to bring it home. So the next operation was to build a trailer. Anyway, 8 years later, my mother said, "Cut it out." Not my wife, my mother. And we stopped racing then, and then Steve Earle rescued us. And
all of us, yeah.
Solved all that. I had, in the meantime, bought a barn find wrecked whatever Bugatti and spent the next 10 years putting it together. And Steve came and gave me the adrenaline to finish it and go racing in 1977. What a wonderful man. Thank you, Steve.
Barn find Bugatti. That'd be fun.
Yes.
Yeah, modify a barn find Bugatti.
We modified it a little bit, but it still looks like a Bugatti.
All right, how about Dan Hogan? How did you get the fire to race?
Oh boy. I grew up in the Midwest, Rockford, Illinois. We had a quarter-mile asphalt track where they raced midgets. I learned to drive when I was 12 years old in a 1926 dump truck at a sand and gravel pit. I learned how to double clutch. I learned how to shift with no clutch at all. Fast forward several years, I got sucked into the Army during the Korean conflict. Fortunately, though, I ended up in Germany, where I was fortunate again to go to the Nürburgring. I got terribly interested in photography, thought I was going to make that my career. That changed when I got out of the service and got back to Santa Barbara. And I said, I'm never leaving this town again. And I never did, except for 6 months. Sold my Oldsmobile 88 and got an MG TF. And Claude Phipps had the dealership at that point. That was on the Carrillo Street. It's now a paint store. And Claude kind of took an interest in me because I hung out there almost every damn day. And he entered me in the sports car races out at the airport. And I didn't know squat about racing. I really didn't. I taught myself how to heel and toe and a few other things. That I wore out 2 sets of tires and 1 transmission in 1 summer. Anyway, I don't know how many times I raced at the airport, but a lot. I got into an MGA and then got noticed by a guy that worked for Claude Phipps, and he decided he was going to start a small racing team, and I got fortunate enough to be really good friends with E. Forbes Robinson. A lot of you guys remember him. He was, I think, a really fantastic driver. He could get more out of a low-energy car than anybody I've ever known. And then this guy decides he's going to open a foreign car dealership in Hawaii. So I was footloose, fancy-free, and I signed up for that very quickly. And he ended up with 5 race cars at this dealership. He had an MGA, a Seata 208S, which I dearly, dearly loved, and a bobtail Cooper that had a little 1100 cc, I think it was, Orwin, Climax engine. Ended up being, that was my favorite car I ever drove. It was amazing. And we competed in the first Hawaiian Grand Prix in Hawaii. And it was quite an event. We had, like I said, we had 5 race cars at this dealership, and I was the only driver. So I raced all day. It had 1 car, and Vince would have another one ready. I'd just get out of 1 car and get into another, and it was unbelievable. I was in race car heaven. I guess I was really just a boy racer, though. I'm kind of honored to be up here with all these guys that have a lot more racing background than I did. But I had tremendous great time in my life. It was really something. I later got into photography as an offshoot from my Army days and my Nürburgring exposure. And I've just been a car nut all my life. I still am. I graduated into a street rod that I still have. And I think my favorite car was the Seata 208S, which was powered by a little Fiat 2-liter engine, wasn't it, Orwin?
2-liter.
Little V8. And they only made 35 of those. And I thought, I hope that's not my damn phone.
I think that's you, Dan. I'm checking my phones, and I don't think it's me.
Is that yours or mine?
Yeah, I think it's yours. I like it. It's a nice
Peggy?
ring.
Oh, I got to go home and take a pill. Anyway. Anyway.
We only have an hour and a half to go. That's all. So it's not that.
Because they only made 35 of these Seattles, I thought I'd never see one again until I ended up down at a Cars and Coffee event in Montecito that was a nice place to go take your car every Sunday. Right? Right.
Right.
And I got there late one day. I was wandering around looking at the cars, and I walked up behind this great big hearse limousine, and right next to it was this 208S Seata. Oh, God, I thought, how could that be? How could I ever? They only made 35. They're very rare. And I started talking to the guy that owned it, and his name was Dan Kolodziejski. What a name, huh? Super guy. And the more I talked with him, he said, would you like to take a seat? I said, sure. He said, I raced one of these in Honolulu. He says, oh, really? Tell me about it. I said, well, my car, Dan's car, is a maroon color, and the one I raced in Hawaii was white. He said, oh, wait a minute. You worked at a dealership there? Yeah, I did. In fact, I ended up selling the car to a guy in Hawaii. His name was Ching. I've forgotten his first name. He said, was it Calvin Ching? Yeah, that's the guy. He said, Dan, the car you're sitting in is your old race car.
Oh, wow.
I about died. Wow. I couldn't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
And he
how many years between when you raced and when you ran into it again?
I'm sorry?
How many years between when you last raced in it and when you saw it at Cars and Coffee?
I was over in Hawaii in 57, and this had to be 20 years later.
Uh-huh.
20, 40.
That was unreal.
40 years.
Huh?
40 years.
40 years.
40 years. Oh, my God. Thank you. I flunked math. Anyway, he flipped me the keys. He said, we're going for a ride. You're driving. And I've been good friends with Dan ever since. And every now and again, he lets me go for a drive in his Seata. And I guess I've just been nothing but a boy racer. But I had a heck of a good time.
You did pretty well for a guy who doesn't know anything about racing. All right. Well, Lee touched on it a while ago about the Thunderbowl, which is a huge part of local racing history. It was a quarter-mile oval on the bluffs. It was in the 1940s and 50s. A lot of jalopy races on Monday nights. They had huge crowds out there. Again, Lee, you raced out there. What's it like? I mean, take us back in time. What was it like to get into a race car back then and drive at the Thunderbowl?
Well, when that racing started, the jalopy racing. Okay, prior to that, they had midget races there. Thunderbowl. That's how the Thunderbowl was originally designed for and built. And down in San Bernardino, a bunch of guys got together and they were racing in an old dirt field out there, and they'd go around and collect little money from the people, to help pay for it. Well, and that evolved into being the California Jalopy Association. So they had several tracks down south that they ran on, and the promoters were always looking for another track, and they wanted something up in this area because there was nothing really going on here. And so they convinced Mr. Slayball, who owned the track and the property, that they would like to promote these jalopy races. Well, When it first started out, I tell you, it wasn't really racing. It was like roller derby with cars. I mean, it was pretty crude, and I was a little apprehensive about getting into this at first because there was nothing better than somebody else putting you in a wall. That was, the big thing. If they did, I mean, the people loved it. They loved to see the crashes and the rollovers and all that. Well, that wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to learn how to drive. I wanted to learn how to race. So, but anyway, I kind of stuck it out, and eventually it turned around to being a real competitive sport. And there were quite a few drivers who ended up being well known that raced there over the period of years.
Parnelli Jones was one of them, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. I raced quite a bit with him, and we became kind of friends there at the track and so forth. Yeah.
As much as you can on the track, right?
Pardon?
As much you can be friends as much as you can on the racetrack.
Well,
right?
He had a temper. We won't go into that, but
Lee, I'm going to interrupt you for just a minute. I'm going to show you a picture of the Thunderbowl that Jim Harris brought with him, and you'll probably recognize this. And I'm going to show it to the audience. Whoop.
Well, I'm not in that, but I tell you, that car 61 there, that was my friend Rip Erickson, who I grew up with in high school. And he and Keith Loomis and I, we all raced there, but we weren't of age. Keith and Rip were a year older than me. But fortunately, I wasn't in that melee, but I've been in a couple of them.
And Jim, why don't you make a comment on this picture?
It has a date of 1950 on it. It's a painting, and I don't know who the artist is, but he supposedly drew an actual accident. And the yellow car 53 is one my dad sponsored, and I was there every Monday night. I love to run up there.
This is at the Thunderbowl. Thank you, guys.
Is that the price on the back? Because I'll buy it.
Keith,
It's either $1 or $10.
It's 110.
at the Thunderbowl.
He started a little
I'll give you 15.
He did.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I was doing some research on the Thunderbowl, and I saw in an article where somebody who was there said that they believed that some people there spent more money on refreshments than some of the drivers did on their cars.
Well, that's partially true. But towards the end of it, we got pretty professional. I mean, the last car that my partner and I built, we ended up winning a championship with it, but we ran a couple other tracks also, not just Carpinteria, at that time. But it was more a professional car, and racing got to be more professional.
Is that when you put the short doors on that car?
Yes, it is.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we cheated just a little
No.
bit.
It's not cheating.
Well, it wasn't cheating because you had to use Ford parts,
right?
And we had a Ford car. Well,
it's creative.
To make a long story short, as they say, what we did was that we wanted to shorten up the wheelbase a little bit so nobody would notice it. So in 1933 and 1934, they had two-door and four-door cars. Well, the two-door cars were long doors. The four-door cars were short front doors because they had a rear door. So we took the short front doors and put on our two-door sedan, which had long doors, and moved the body a little bit forward and moved the wheels a little bit forward, and it looked perfectly stock, And then our good friend Bob Jank, who was a mastermind at building motors, flatheads, and also for the Chevy V8s. Well, he helped us build the motor. He took a liking to us in the way we build our cars. So that car ran quite well. But
Jake's building it, yeah.
There were several tracks here. there was a half-mile track at Lompoc at the old fairgrounds that we ran on, a half-mile dirt track at the old fairgrounds in Santa Maria we ran on, and then the Model T Club, they sponsored those. Then the Model T Club built a track at Middleton, which was, well, I'd say 3/8 of a mile, but it was just dirt. I mean, it was terrible, dust and dirt. And then there was a short-lived track in Oxnard down the river bottom that our club finally finished building. And we only ran for a short time because the Bureau of Reclamation, they took over the land because it was a water flow situation. So that ended that.
Anybody else have any fond memories or not so fond memories of the Thunderbowl?
I remember going to watch Lee race, but I didn't know Lee. But I was about 10 years old or 8 years old, and I would go with my mom and dad in our 40 Ford pickup, and I'd just squinch in the middle between the two of them, and we would go, and they had a traffic light for the green, yellow, and red, you know. So I remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have great memories of the Thunderbowl as a spectator, not as a driver.
My father ended up, he and Frank Colson, who I drove for originally, who quit running cars, but I went on to drive other cars. But anyway, my father and Frank Colson, they were in charge of the pit gate and took care of the infield and the pit passes and all that for quite a few years down there. So my father, he was behind me doing this. Yeah.
Is it true that when they shut down the Thunderbowl, they buried a bunch of the wrecked cars there?
Well, the deal is, I think, there was some stuff that was left laying around there, and I think Mr. Slayball pushed it over the cliff down there. But then the state took over that property at the time because there used to be a hill there, Highway 101. There was a pretty steep hill going out right past the Thunderbowl and down, and they wanted to level that hill out. So that's why they took all that dirt, pushed it in it where the golf course and so forth is now. Today, there's some cars buried there, yeah, there probably are.
Anybody else, any memories about the Thunderbowl? Then we're going to talk about airport racing. I know a lot of folks are interested in that too. Any more comments about the Thunderbowl? No? All right, let's move on.
Well, I have a question for Dan. Do you remember when we worked for A.M. Walker?
Yeah.
We worked on a lot of race cars there.
Indeed. Hank Colonel?
Yes.
He was a mechanic. He was a genius with anything that he touched went faster.
Oh, yeah. We did a lot of MG stuff there, too. And then Mr. Harcourt's Ferrari.
Yeah, he did. I remember one day I was Hastings Harcourt.
Yeah, we took care of his Ferrari. Yeah.
Had a ZF rear end on it.
Yeah.
And it went bad. And Hank took it out. He had it in a vise. He took the case off, and everything fell on the floor. Grease, oil, and with no manual or nothing, he put it all back together. It worked great.
Well, I think at that time we changed. I helped him work on that a little bit, and I think we changed the gear ratio in it too.
Yeah.
And I think it ended up that used Studebaker gears for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe they were cheap and available. I don't know.
Where did Hank work?
Yep.
For Mr. Walker.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do any of you guys remember Paramount Ranch?
Do I know what happened to him? Yeah.
They raced there 2 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The track was designed by Ken Miles and some other guy I don't recall.
Yeah.
And they had it all set up, and all of a sudden they decided that it was dangerous for the spectators. So Ken said, well, let's reverse the direction of the track.
Right.
And all the guardrails were now backwards.
Yeah.
The sharp edge was facing the wrong way.
Ooh,
yeah.
And sure enough, Eve Forbes Robinson, Robbie, took me around that track walking it, and we got to that one turn. He said, Danny, he called me Danny Boy. He said, Danny Boy, don't ever let anybody get inside you on this turn. He said, if you have to give up a position, give it up. Sure enough, one guy got off the track and hit that guardrail.
Oh, yeah.
Went right through the radiator into his, chopped off one of his legs, and he bled out. They only raced there 2 years and killed 4 people.
Right.
Yeah.
It was a dangerous track.
Yeah.
You know, there was a question about the Thunderbowl, and there was a few hands raised during that session. So we're going to have a Q&A right after all these interviews. So hold on to your questions for later.
One interesting thing with the race there at the Paramount Ranch is the Corvette that I have now, the 57. The fella bought it, and he basically he bought it in September the 15th. I'm looking at the paper on it. 15th of 57, and he went to race at Paramount Ranch a month later. He was there and ran the car. And then a month later, he went out here to Pomona, this kind of thing. But that Corvette was run at that race you're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, interesting. He stayed out of everything, but yeah. Yeah. Actually, it was kind of interesting in another sense. I'm not exactly sure, but he did this. He got racing immediately, like that. In 1 month, he's out there racing. And then he did the other. And I don't think after he finished at Pomona, he ever raced at a racetrack again. I think maybe the Paramount Ranch thing kind of persuaded him, I don't think I want to go down this road.
I went down to, just as a fun thing one time, and you could still see part of the asphalt track. It was all grown up everywhere, but boy, it was a scenic place to have a racetrack, but it was dangerous.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting how that comes together.
Yeah.